Hi everyone. Okay, so in today's session we're going to be having a look at some of the cures for the Black Death. Now, cures we're going to put in inverted commas, which we'll come back to in a minute, and we're going to have a look at what medieval medicine was like. We're going to see how people tried to cure the Black Death and did any of these cures work. Okay, now before we start on that, I just want to go through some of the symptoms of the Black Death, which you may already know, but I just want us to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we are aware of what the Black Death actually physically looks like. So before we go on to that though, I just want to point out, if you were aware, that the plague actually has three different ways that it presents. One is bubonic, another one is pneumonic, and then the third one is septicemic. Okay, so you might hear any of these three terms being used when we're talking about the plague. Now, the Black Death did come in three different ways, but the one that we're going to focus on, and the one that was most widespread and contagious, was the bubonic plague. Okay, now if we have a look at this drawing, absolutely lovely drawing, this illustration of the bubonic plague, we can see here that all of these little dots on the victims are actually buboes. Okay, and buboes would mainly come in areas like under your armpits, in your neck, basically in the creases of your body, underneath in your elbows, your knees, your groin area. And they were sometimes the size of an egg, and they were sometimes the size of an apple. Okay, now in order to understand how just uncomfortable this disease would have been physically, what I do if I was teaching this in school quite often is, and you might want to try this at home, don't do it with a raw egg. You could do it with boiled egg, or you could do it with an apple, is lie down on a table and put an apple underneath your knee, or just sit there with an apple underneath your armpit or underneath your knee, and just see how uncomfortable that would have been. And have a look at how many of them there are on these people's bodies. Okay, it was a very, very uncomfortable disease physically. It's not just an internal thing. And what the buboes were pus-filled sores. So they were completely full of just a buildup of like yellow gunk, really. So that's where the bubonic plague gets its name from. And the Black Death actually gets its name from the people would have had bruises basically on their body, which was in bleeding just under their skin, which would have made their bodies look like they might have had a black rash, which is why it's called the Black Death. Okay, so there are a couple of the symptoms. Now we're just going to have a look at this account here. So this was written by a man in Florence in Italy at the time of the Black Death. So he was writing at the time, and this is what he describes. Okay, he says its earliest symptom was the appearance of fierce swellings in the groin of the armpit, some of which were egg-shaped, whilst others were roughly the size of a common apple. So this is what we were looking at just then. So people have called these swellings buboes. By the second day, the victim would violently cough and vomit blood. The following day, people have been known to find dark blotches. So as we were just saying, this is where the Black Death gets its name from, and bruises under their skin, sometimes very large. If the victim was still alive, so by this point, by the third day, so this isn't a long illness, by the third day, if the victim was still alive, they could be seen shaking uncontrollably, so that's as the disease affects their nervous system, in their beds, screaming to God for relief. So that basically means that they were begging for death by this point. By the fifth day, God would finally show his mercy. The swellings might release a foul stench and a dark liquid, which would sometimes mean that the victim had been spared. It's worth noting that that wasn't very often. This was more often than not a death sentence if you got the Black Death. But most times death would come swiftly, ending the aimless pain and releasing his soul to God's will. So obviously not a very pleasant description of a disease there, but as it says here, it was that terrible that people were begging to die rather than carrying on living with this disease. It took its victims quite quickly, and it spread ferociously. So that's what we're dealing with. So you can think why people would have been so desperate to try and find a cure. Now, I've mentioned a number of times in the previous 2 videos that we've done so far on the Black Death that there was an extreme lack of medical knowledge at the time, which meant that they couldn't stop it spreading. So we're going to see whether they can stop it once you've actually got it. Now, before we move on to look at what people did to try and cure the Black Death, we'll just have an overview of medieval medicine. Now, medicine doesn't advance very much for a 1500-year period, okay, and that is because of 2 doctors, one from ancient Greece and one from ancient Rome, called Galen and Hippocrates. Okay, and Galen and Hippocrates have a massive influence on medicine, and they both support this, which is called the theory of the 4 humours. Okay, and the reason that these 2 characters mean that medicine doesn't really advance very much is because they both have the support of the church at the time, and the church was an extremely powerful institution because people believed in heaven and hell very, very fiercely. Everybody was religious at this time. There wasn't that you went to church, okay, and if they had the support of the church, people didn't want to challenge them. And the theory of the 4 humours is this here. So the idea was that everything in the body belonged to one of these elements. So everything was either hot, dry, wet or cold. And you had yellow bile, which was represented fire, black bile to represent the earth, phlegm, which represented water, and blood, which represented air. And the way that this theory worked was if you had a cold, for example, you had too much of this element, you had too much water, and you were probably too cold. Okay, and you can see where that came from, because if you've got a cold, you may be coughing things up, and the idea was that you had too much water. So to counteract that, what you needed was to be hot and dry. So they would try and balance out the 4 humours. The idea was you had a certain amount of them, and if you had too much of one, you had to balance that out. So what they actually did for the Black Death was, the idea was if you had too much blood, you needed to get rid of some of that blood. And a lot of the medicine in medieval times involved leeches. So if you're not sure what leeches are, they are animals that grip onto your skin and suck your blood. So it was called bloodletting. Okay, so one of these was ways they tried to cure the Black Death was bloodletting, and that's based on the theory of the 4 humours. Now, it's worth mentioning at this point that medical knowledge didn't really exist in terms of what we have today. They didn't know about germs, they didn't know about bacteria, they didn't know about how particles could get into your body, they didn't know about the immune system. And one of the reasons that they didn't know about this is because of the influence of the church. People couldn't dissect bodies. Okay, they couldn't actually cut open a body and go into it. So a lot of their theories were based on animals. Okay, so Galen, for example, studied pigs and he studied apes. So he based a lot of the knowledge about the human body and human anatomy based on animals, which obviously we are different species. And a lot of the medical information we had was incorrect because of that. But also the technology that we had today, they didn't have. So they didn't have microscopes, they couldn't see the bacteria, so they didn't know what was going on. That came much, much later. Therefore, the cures were basically them trying anything. They were so desperate to try and cure themselves that they were trying all sorts, as we'll have a look at now. So one of these ways that they tried to cure the Black Death was bloodletting. Okay, another way was rubbing onions on their buboes, or if you could, if you happen to see one on the street, you could get a chopped up snake and you could rub that all over your buboes. You could get a dead chicken, plucked. Okay, you didn't want a chicken with feathers, that wouldn't work. A dead chicken. You could also get a pigeon, and you could rub that on your buboes, and that might help. Okay, so we can see here, can't we, these patterns emerging of things that we know today would not have any effect at all, but they were trying as hard as they could. Two things that, so you could drink vinegar. Okay, you could also eat or drink mercury or arsenic. Now, these two are incredibly poisonous. Okay, so you're not going to get anywhere by drinking mercury or arsenic. Now, when we had a look at the spread of the causes of the Black Death, pardon me, when we had a look at the causes of the Black Death, we did say that one of them could have been, what people thought the Black Death could have been, was a punishment from God. And I did mention this there, that people, a lot of people whip themselves basically to say to God. They would go on processions, they would parade through the streets, and they would say, look, God, I'm punishing myself, so you don't need to punish me. And they would walk around the street and they would whip themselves, and they thought, well, if they've punished themselves, then God isn't going to punish them. He might spare them from the Black Death. Okay, so we can see here that these aren't medical cures. They aren't anything that would actually work today. They are people who are desperate and who have no knowledge of what's happening to them or why it's happening to them, desperately clutching at something that they think might help them. What we actually see in a later, so not the Black Death, but a later occurrence of the plague, which is from 1361 to 1364, we see here that doctors are popping the buboes, and they've figured out by this point, so about 20 years later, they figured out that that can actually help, and that might help the victim get better if they release some of these poisonous liquids that are held within these buboes. Okay, you may have seen, I'm just going to put this in its own little box. You may have heard of plague doctors, and they were doctors who would walk around with a mask on with a beak in it. Now they're later, they're more in the 1600s, the plague doctors, so don't confuse the plague doctors with the Black Death. They're more for the Great Plague in the 1600s, and they're sort of later. And in the beaks that they had on the masks, they would keep like sweet smelling flowers, because remember, if from the earlier video, that one of the causes, one of the things that they thought caused the Black Death was a bad smell, so they would go around and smell nice smelling flowers and things. So the plague doctors are not something that we're concerned with now, but you may have come across those, you may have heard of them. Okay, so did they work? Now again, it is very black and white here. The answer is no. There was nothing that they could have done at that time with the medical knowledge that they had or didn't have to cure the Black Death. The Black Death was a bacteria, it was a living thing. It could not be cured by chopping up a snake and rubbing it on your buboes. That would not have worked. The closest they got to something like a cure was this one here, so popping them, that might have had some kind of effect, but what they would have needed to actually cure the Black Death was antibiotics. Okay, and that's why we can cure it today, and that's why we don't have the Black Death anymore, because we do have something that can help. But it is because of this extreme lack of medical knowledge and this stagnation, which means keeping still, this stagnation in medicine that we have at this time. We've got no advancements at this point in medical knowledge. They come quite a lot later on in the 18 and 1900s with microscopes and things like that, that we can actually learn about bacteria and how to cure diseases. Okay, so when we talk about cures for the Black Death, we're not really talking about cures. We're talking about desperate people who are doing whatever they can to try and relieve some of their symptoms and hopefully spare themselves. Okay, so we're back again to the time period, the technology, the knowledge just was not there. Okay, so hopefully that has been of some use to you. In the next session, we're going to be having a look at the consequences of the Black Death and the way that half of the population of Europe dying changes the structure of the whole of life, really, and paves the way for a new social order. Okay, so thank you for tuning in to this session, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next video. Thanks, everyone.